Hello. Today we are going to talk about ethical relativism. But before I jump into a proper discussion, let me just highlight a few concepts as a recapitulation of points from the previous lecture. So what we've all known is that ethics is a normative space. It's existing alongside religion, legal structure, and what else? Social etiquette, but it has, according to Postman, a far grounding impact because it overrides, it takes precedence to the latter. It means that even if we already have this established other normative sources, we still need morality as our constant guide today. And it's a kind of undertaking that every single one of us should consider as our preoccupation. Now, for ethical relativism, we will learn that there are problems, not really problems, big problems, but that there are certain forms of um, as this conflicts to think about as we um, try to now argue that we need morality as our constant guide. All right, so let us take this guide as we move along our discussion. The first will be all about the thesis of relativism. Second is about its forms, and uh, we have here subforms like forms of relativism, namely subjectivism, conventionalism, and a side discussion on toleration, and then the criticisms of relativism and brief conclusion. First is the thesis, the main claim of this argument or of this moral perspective. Um, Relativism is a peculiar ethical viewpoint because it offers to us a rather uh, nuanced outlook of the sophisticated nature of not only morality but also of life in general. The thesis of relativism states first that there are no objective moral standards. Now, on the right corner of the monitor here, you'll notice these bulbs. There are several of them, and I found them important as they are, I think, the straight analogical tool to understanding morality or ethical um, norms as light or guide, right? But going back to the discussion here, um, it doesn't say that it says rather that there are no objective moral standards. Um, it means that it's not possible to take the Kantian formula that we can have a universalizable claim to morality. And it says further that the impossibility of not having an objective moral standard stems from the impossibility of uh, a universal acceptance of a particular norm. So that gives us a that gives us a point to reconsider the norms that what we cherish and norms that we consider to be all encompassing because this thesis here cannot be what this thesis cannot be undermined. If it's a fact that we have moral norms, it's also a fact that there is a moral theory that challenges the possibility of um, attaining or having a universalized moral principle. However, what this thesis doesn't say is that there are no moral standards at all. So to think that there are no objective moral standards is one thing, and to think that there are no moral standards at all is another. In other words, Moral relativism is not the same with moral nihilism. The relativist still believes in a morality but denies the possibility of having a universalized and objective ethical or moral standards. I think we have to be, be very clear with that important distinction.
Further, according to Pojman, there are two forms of ethical relativism. The first form is called it is called subjectivism, yeah, which um, claims that individual judgment of the acceptability of the right and the unacceptability of human actions are strong enough, already to ground the justification of, let's say, for example, action A. Now, the source for this kind of position is the self, the individual, which is to some extent guided by his rational or her rational capacities to determine which actions are acceptable or not, regardless of what the social environment or other people, or for that matter, culture, tells that individual. Or here in subjectivism, the individual is given the freedom to pick for herself what she can consider as her normative position, and she may stand to it and argue or defend it regardless of deep-seated culture that first accommodates that person. Now, the other form is called conventionalism. Now, in the word itself, we can see that by conventionalism, Pojman means this ethnocentrism or culturalism. Here, the source of ethical judgment or understanding of what human actions can only be acceptable or unacceptable is, of course, always culture or the certain collective, right? So that, for example, um, this is what makes like a particular culture in a position to dispense with its collective judgment over certain acts. And pretty obviously, there is, to some extent, if not all the time, going to be a clash between the subjective, the subject, and the individual. Sorry, the subject and the collective. In a Hegelian manner or understanding, subjectivism can be also called individualism, while or particularism, while conventionalism refers to universal universality, right? Something like that. Now, there is always a tension between the particular and the universal, especially when they come across with crucial questions such as like freedom and and other forms of expression. Yeah. So these are the forms of ethical relativism that we always have to bear in mind.
That's why I place these bulbs here as an analogy, maybe a representation, a very weak one. But I trust that these simple presentations here, this simple format, can help bring out the point. And the point is that morality is like a bulb, a light that guides. The problem is that there are several cultures and individual perspectives out there that sometimes don't connect, sometimes come into conflict against each other. And if you notice, there are several colors here. These colors, the way I designed them, represent uh, cultural differences. There are colors that are repeated. That means that these colors are dominant in society, or this conventional moral perspective is dominant, and there is one here that is really very dominating. This one, most dominating, is the color blue. So there are different cultures and conventions. They have different impacts on society, but some of them are really very dominating. Now let's talk about form of conventionalism. Remember, conventionalism is the, well, to some extent they call it the magnified picture of subjectivism. But conventionalism says that there are standards that are generated by different traditions. So there are different standards since there are different traditions, right? And conventionalism follows certain thesis, and that is the thesis of first we have here dependency and uh, the diversity thesis. Now, dependency thesis says that um, right and wrong derived their validity from cultural acceptance. The other thesis says that right and wrong varies from among societies or varies among societies. So the point here is that um, a certain normative guide or norm or law exists because there is a space that allows it to exist. If you eliminate that space, then you eliminate that norm also. I mean, that's a logical consequence or implication to happen or to show. If there are no cultural spaces or groups, then there are no group ethics or cultural ethical notions, right? And if the culture dissipates or it disintegrates, then what is left is the individual. So now we go back to individualism. This is how strong the theory of relativism is. If the culture is eliminated, then you still need not worry because the individual survives. And even at the death of the individual, the culture still continues. So we find this really very puzzling or paradoxical, interesting. Okay, tell them again, but the point there is that the relationship between culture and individual is so embedded. It's so what's this complex that even if the individual goes away or goes, the culture remains, and sometimes even if the culture disintegrates, the individual survives, and that is this kind of relationship or capacity is what makes relativism a strong ethical thesis, right? The universality doesn't exist. It's either only the individual or the culture that remains. Uh, so the point here is that well, a few points that there is no singular morality, as is well. Uh, what's this? Um, Shown in the picture of the bulbs here or the light bulbs. There is no singular morality, and that even if there is, which is not actually the case, morality, right and wrong, does not exist in a vacuum. It's always circumstantial. Like there is always a context for a moral norm or moral law to make sense or to what to pick up or gather pack its validity. So no morality is empty. It's always this kind of like dynamic relationship, right, between events and norms, and that that society's intentions or goals depend so much, or that right and wrong depends on society's intentions or goals. This is really the I don't know if you consider this beautiful, but to me it is also like a thing that we must be careful about in approaching. It says that a society dictates what is right and wrong. But what about Nazism or the tradition culture of the anti-Semitic culture? That's also like, uh, that is a terrible picture, right? I mean, that's a terrible source for justification of right and justification of wrong. And We have to always like consider that as we make like policies or laws and many other stuff. So this is a peculiar and serious thing to consider. But then it doesn't say time and again that there are no moral standards. It only says that standards vary and we have to accept that. Now, how about conventionalism and tolerance? Um, Ruth Benedict says that conventionalism makes us appreciate the value of tolerance. And she said that we shall arrive at a more realistic social faith, um, accepting as grounds of hope and as new basis for tolerance the coexisting and equally valid patterns of life which mankind has created for itself from the raw materials of existence. The point here is that, um, well, let's just say that there are differences, right? And if you respect this thing that makes you different from other, then you will also start to appreciate or respect that thing that makes the other different from you. And because of that, he will now, according to the logic here, start to like tolerating in the form of respect each other's difference or peculiarity. So conventionalism, the elimination of conventionalism or the non-allowing of different cultures to practice their very own belief will eventually lead to what? A totalitarian form of ethical perspective or a dogmatic ethical point of view, which is no less dangerous than than what history uh, has shown us today. So controlling differences is much more dangerous. Controlling differences and eliminating differences um, is what is more dangerous than just allowing this peculiarity of people. It's dangerous. Not the It's not allowing people that is dangerous, but it's suppressing them. I think that's the main point here of Ruth Benedict. And yeah, Stephanie Shipper Hughes kind of like supported this claim when she said that Westerners usually show condescending attitude toward cultural spaces. Like for example, we the Western culture boasts, for example, its culture over non-Western counterparts. Like for example, the practice of genital mutilation as a form of violation to human rights or whatever. What is being always highlighted is the universal condition of rights of man. What is not being considered also is peculiarities of cultures and their nuanced practices and differences. Like when, for example, you heard about female genital mutilation, well, it's undeniably very painful and to some extent very dangerous process. And we look at it that way, but we don't look at it from perspective of a culture that practices it. And so you said that um, we don't know better actually. So we can only uh, act in an ethnographic way. We cannot condemn cultures because of their differences, and we should not impose our very own onto others. So Melville Heskovitz provided uh, a moral argument in a syllogistic form. Um, he says that in support for conventionalism and cultural tolerance, he said that if morality is relative to its culture, then there is no independent basis for criticizing the morality of any other culture but one's own. If there is no independent way of criticizing any other culture, then we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures as well. But because morality is relative to its culture, therefore we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures. That's a convincing point. I mean, this is a perfectly valid argument. I'm not saying I agree totally to it, but what I'm just trying to say is that, well, they made very good points or arguments in favor of conventionalism and the need for toleration or tolerance. And here is a peculiar, was this uh, point coming from Slavoj Zizek. However, Postman provides several criticisms against conventionalism, and he here offers four criticisms. Okay. I mean, you can also see the bias of the author, right? He in the chapter one argued for the overriding characteristic of morality, and number one, its universalizable um, character. In other words, Postman is clearly favoring um, ethical objectivism or is battling against conventionalism. But let's see how he does it. And he provides here first a polemic or argument, which says um, conventionalism undermines important value. His proof for this are the following points. Number one, he said that a conventionalist is, or it's impossible for a conventionalist, a culturalist, to criticize heinous um, principles such as the Nazi ideology and that the historical commission of evil is indistinguishable from the saintly actions like uh, Mother Teresa or Jesus Christ or Malcolm X. The point here of Postman is that um, suppose that all that every culture is right in terms in relation to their practice, then if everyone is right, then who's wrong, right? So what is now our basis for criticizing? What is now your basis for criticizing the other culture? If you, in the first place, believe or are convinced that every cultural logic is at work and is valid. So a relativist cannot criticize, according to Postman, anyone outside their own culture. A relativist finds himself in an impasse, like he is now, you know, he can no longer move forward. Number three, or number 2 point, the value of moral reforms in terms of revolting against institutionalized forms of cultural hegemony is being undermined. So, for example, you will no longer appreciate Christ or Mother Teresa in their uh, act of resistance against, for example, in Christ context, against the Jewish culture, or Mother Teresa against, the against the onslaught of imperialism, because you would look at imperialism as and a Jewish cultural practice as conventional spaces themselves. So if you again are a believer of conventionalism, then and if you tolerate them, then you will find yourself at a paradoxical point. Like you don't like them, but you have to tolerate them because they maintain a particular logic of their own. So and you no longer can tolerate, for example, you can no longer appreciate the heroism of our Filipino early Filipino ancestors because they fought against the Spaniards, and and there's a lot more of complication according to Postman with conventionalism. The second critical point says that conventionalism uh, will lead eventually to subjectivism. Like what I said earlier, um, conventionalism and subjectivism is always at odds with each other. They eventually find themselves in a paradoxical point when conventionalism disintegrates, but the subject remains, or when the even the subject dies, the convention goes on. So there is this kind of like cycle of continuity, discontinuity, antagonism between subjectivism and conventionalism. Let's, for example, say that I belong to, or I was born to, uh, into into a community of thieves or robbers. Then I cannot, if I stick to the thesis of conventionalism, get out of the community because I should believe that the community is right and it's practicing the correct thing. Now, if I die, the community continues. But once the person, like for example, realize uh, that things are messed up, then he starts to instigate a rebellion or revolution against a particular community and will eventually lead to the foreclosure or disintegration of the community. And when the community disintegrates, the individual remains, right? But then again, there are times that even when the uh, cultural logic ended or ends, some practitioners of that logic still survive. For example, Trumpism and many Nazism and many other traditional political crimes that exist today. So the first problem, according to Postman, is that it's difficult to define culture and society, right? And that we don't know what makes a particular culture. Number matters, but yes, to what extent does, or to which number, to which extent can a particular number still act at a particular role? And and also because every culture has a different value emphasis. For example, you belong to a culture that practices cannibalism, and and um, you can't get outside it. You will eventually have to even justify cannibalism itself. Therefore, that is a problem, right? And here is, I think, a very convincing argument. The individual members of a specific culture will be torn between their cultural affiliation and civic duty. Think of being a Christian and a legislator or senator at the same time. So your colleagues pass the the abortion bill or law or whatever, but then again, you are not going to vote for it because you are bothered by your Christian soul. But then allowing your Christian morality or soul to dominate would also lead to a compromise of your civic duty, right? Because you're to think about to think about and for everybody, including people of no belief or the atheist. But then again, if you practice too conventionalism too hard, then you find yourself in a dilemma, and that's what makes it really very very problematic. And so the third criticism follows, which says, um, I think this is the last batch of criticism, but this is the third one. The the comment here says that weak dependency does not imply relativism. Okay, what dependency thesis says that society or moral norms exist because they are being accepted, right? Or there's a community that holds or accommodates them. Now, weak dependency says that to some extent a community is just too small, yet it comprises a moral number or a moral force. And the idea of weak dependency that society um, accommodates a relativist notion is not a guarantee that the claim of relativism already in itself is valid. But the point here is simple. Just because there are several or a big chunk of population that believes, right, or several groups of people, or people that believes in, you know, in mass extermination as a moral command, does not necessarily mean that that moral command itself is already valid or acceptable. So there is a difference between the dimension of people who accept the moral command and the validity of the moral command itself. I think that's the point here in the third argument. It doesn't mean that, or the point here is that just because you guys, majority unanimously vote for A does not necessarily make a valid or appropriate solution or response, right? That's, I think, the main idea there. And the last is the indeterminacy of language. The point here is that, according to Pojman, um, what's this? The language or the problem there is being exaggerated. You know, so here the point is that um, it's language is the essence of a culture and fundamentally shapes its reality. Cutting the culture off from other languages and cultures, right? So it says that society's moral principles depend on unique linguistic grounded culture. But the thing is that it places an exclusivist relationship between morality and language. So, uh, culture is articulated by a particular language. So, in a particular language, a morality is inscribed. But because there are so many languages there and cultures, therefore, there are different uh, moral points of views that are also embedded in these differences. But the point of Postman here is that wait a minute. Uh, why won't we also think that even moral principles that are scattered can be communicated transculturally? So differences in culture and linguistic expressions are actually not the barrier to coming up with an objective moral standard. Now, this is the main point or argumentation of Bushman in the textbook, and he what we can get from this point is going to be my last point. We can get from his presentation is that he doesn't really like relativism. I mean, he is against it. The author is against subjectivism. Well, one thing is because it offers, according to him, more harm than good, and that's one thing. Another thing, and this is I think the most fundamental one, is because objectivity is possible. So, Postman hangs on to the possibility of, or holds on to the possibility of objectivism, and that clearly shows to us his Kantian bias for doing morality or ethics. Now, to conclude the whole lecture, uh, the thesis of relativism is really powerful. I mean, the debate between objectivism and relativism still is on today, and a lot more of relativistic ethical theorists have popped up on the academic landscape. But the author here is saying that, well, come to think about the impact of relativism. It's one thing to say that it's really convincing. It's another thing to consider whether we really should pursue it, right? That's another point for discussion. And Postman is saying that, well, perhaps the relativists have exaggerated their claims uh, uh, and failed to see that a compromise, or not necessarily a compromise, but an objective moral uh, point, one that is universalizable and one that is also binding, can be ever attained. And as to what it is like, and as to what kind of discussion Boschman gave to it, that's going to be the task for our next analysis. But for now, I hope you learned something and I hope it made sense. And this is chapter 2 on moral ethical relativism.